I'm Dudu. Hi everyone. First of all, I want to say a huge thank you for tuning in. I'm so happy to have you here. I'm Dudu, and together we're going to build a design system that actually works in the real world. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You open up Figma and think, wait, what blue did I use last time? Or was this gap 8 pixels or 10 pixels? After overthinking it for a bit, you eventually just sneakily copy and paste it from the next page over. We've all been there, right? We bring up design system because we want to work more efficiently, but starting one can feel totally overwhelming. You might hit a wall with all the jargon, like, what's a token anyway? Or what's a foundation? That's exactly why I put this course together. This isn't going to be one of those stiff, boring lectures full of heavy theory. Instead, we're going to dive into the everyday struggles we face in our actual work and see how we can solve them using this smart tool called a system in a way that's easy and actually fun. All right, before we dive in, why don't we start with some fun questions to see if the things we've always taken for granted might actually be misconceptions? Ready to get started? All right, let's start with our very first question. Is what you've been building a real design system? Or is it just a fancy collection of components? I bet many of you have carefully designed buttons, input boxes, and checkboxes in Figma, thinking to yourself, yes, our team's design system is finally done, and feeling pretty proud of it. Well, to be honest, I was exactly the same way when I first started. But here's the thing. Can we really call it a design system just because we've lined up a bunch of pretty components? A true design system isn't just a collection of drawings. It needs to have a flow of shared promises and rules, like, why must this button be this specific color? Or what is the logic behind how this component works? If your library is basically just a parts warehouse where it's convenient to copy and paste from the next page, then it's nothing more than just listing components. In this course, we're going to move beyond just gathering parts. We're going to learn how to design a real design system that serves as the actual backbone of your product. So, shall we dive in and uncover the logic we've been missing all this time? When you first decided to build a design system, I bet your Figma files looked a lot like this. You've got buttons scattered all over the place. The colors are slightly off, and the corner radius is 4 pixels here, but 6 pixels there. It's just totally inconsistent. On every page, you see these similar looking buttons being used all over the place, and I'm sure this looks very familiar to most of you. Looking at this fragmented mess, we all think the same thing. Ugh, this is so disorganized. We seriously need a design system. So, you roll up your sleeves and finally start organizing. And look at this. Everything is so clean now. You've unified all those inconsistent styles into one, and you've neatly lined them up using Figma's component features. You've given them names like primary or default, and you're managing them perfectly as master components. At this point, you probably feel this huge wave of pride thinking, now this is what a real design system looks like. But here's a really important fact. Just because you've neatly gathered these components, can we actually call this a design system? To be blunt, this isn't a design system. It's just a well-organized library, or even just a parts warehouse. There's a huge gap between simply displaying items in a nice way and designing the logic of when, why, and how those items should be used. It's on an entirely different level. What we really need to build isn't just a simple listing of components. It's a set of living rules that flow through the entire product. So, I just said that listing components isn't a design system. Does that mean the components you've worked so hard on are completely useless? Not at all. The library you've carefully organized and turned into components is actually a very precious piece of the larger organism we call a design system. What we usually call a library is made of the excellent ingredients and parts that build up the design system. But just because you have a pile of parts doesn't mean the product will suddenly start running on its own, right? All right, so what's the process for the real design system we're about to build together? Like I said, it's not just about drawing a single component and calling it a day. We're going through 4 major core stages. First, the principle, which is our root. Then, systematization to build a structured framework. Next, visual language to dress the design system in our brand's unique look. And finally, development implementation, where it all comes to life as a real product. Only when these 4 stages are organically connected do we truly have a living design system. So, shall we take a closer look at what each stage is all about? First up is principle. It's the very beginning of any design and serves as our most solid root. At this stage, we focus more on why we're building it rather than just what we're making. It's the process of defining the core principles and design philosophy that will guide our team whenever we have to make a design decision. Only when these standards are crystal clear can we maintain a rock-solid system that won't waver, no matter what exceptions come our way later on. Next up is systematization, and this is a stage I really want to emphasize. It is basically the process of building the skeleton of our system. If you're a designer, I'm sure you've heard this term a lot, right? Design tokens. This is exactly where the famous design tokens come into play. It's not just about picking a color or font value. It's the process of turning those values into data by giving them specific meanings and roles. Once this skeleton is solid, the entire design system can adapt flexibly, even if our styles change later on. Once the skeleton is strong, it's time to add our own unique colors, right? The third stage is visual language. On top of the framework we just built, we apply specific UI styles like color, typography, and icons. This is where we complete the visual language we'll use to communicate with our users. It's a truly vital process because it decides the expression of our service, how users will feel and remember us. Last but not least, the stage where all our designs finally become a product that users can actually touch. This is development implementation. It's the process of handing over guides to ensure the designer's intent is reflected 100% in the code, and syncing the final implementation. You can think of it as the final piece of the puzzle, where our designs move beyond being just drawings in Figma and are reborn as a real functioning product. Ultimately, a real design system is about so much more than just grabbing a button and using it. From the core principles and the structured systematization to the visual language style and the final development implementation. Only when you build a screen with components that condense all these processes into one can you truly say, we've applied a proper system. Only through this solid design process can a rock-solid, real product be born. So, did that clear up the first misconception about design systems? But we're not done yet. There are still other misconceptions waiting for us the moment we think we've finally built a system. Shall we move on and see what the second misconception is? Have you ever written a guide like margin 10 pixels next to a button while you were designing? In our minds, we clearly gave it a 10 pixels gap. But so often when we see the actual developed screen, the spacing is implemented totally differently from what we intended. Why does this happen? It's because the design terms we use don't perfectly match the terms used in development. If you want to build a proper design system, you need to go beyond just giving visible spacing. You have to understand whether that space is a margin or a padding from a developer's perspective and apply it correctly in your design. And it's not just about spacing. The terms state and status, which we often mix up, actually have completely different meanings and implementation methods. you need to drop the mindset of, oh, I'll just throw in some spacing and they'll figure it out in dev. Using the right terms in the right context, that is the key to a design system that actually stays in sync with developers. So, shall we start by digging into the truth behind margin and padding, where we make the most mistakes? Take a look at these two types of buttons here. On one side we have the primary button, which is fully filled with a background color, and on the other, we have the link button, which is just clean text without any fill. In reality, this link button isn't just sitting there as plain text. Just like the primary button on the left, it needs to carry that same invisible transparent padding. Why? Because when you hover over or click this button, the background color will fill up that exact area. It's designed to transform, and that space is where the magic happens. But how exactly should we communicate these invisible areas to our developers? This is where a separate set of guidelines becomes essential. If we communicate with a clear guide saying, this button is usually transparent, but it actually occupies this much space, it'll drastically reduce any chances of misunderstanding or confusion between us. Here's what the designer actually intended. It's transparent normally, but when it enters a specific state, the background color should fill up beautifully around this text. In other words, this space surrounding the text must be defined as the internal area of the button. But when you look at the actual developed results, you'll often see the background color sticking right against the text, or the spacing being completely ignored. Why does this happen? It's because the developer understood this space as margin, the area outside the text, and built it that way. But the designer's true intent was padding, the internal spacing within the button itself, including the text. If you just say, give it 10 pixels of space, a developer has no way of knowing if that's an inside gap or an outside gap. Only when we understand the terms correctly and define it as padding does it truly become a real design system that reflects the designer's intent. In the everyday language we use, both margin and padding just mean spacing, or a gap. When a designer says, hey, give me some space here, more often than not, these two terms are totally blurred in their head. To them, it's just an empty space you can see with your eyes. But the moment we start building a common language called a design system, these two words no longer mean the same thing. Let's be crystal clear here. Margin is spacing, and padding is spacing, but margin is absolutely not padding. They occupy different physical locations and operate on completely different logic within the system. Margin controls the distance outside the box, while padding determines the volume inside the box. If you ignore this difference and hide behind the vague word spacing, you'll end up with results where your design intent isn't reflected 100%, just like we saw earlier. As a design system designer, instead of just saying spacing, you should start by asking yourself, is this a margin or is it a padding? Just as much as we talk about spacing, there's another word we use every single day, state. But when you translate this into English, which word do you actually use? I bet most of you have been mixing up state and status without really distinguishing between them. You might say something like, how's the button status? Or, let's define the state for this input field. But as a design system designer, you need to stop for a second here. State and status are different. These two terms differ in how data flows within the system, and the expected outcomes for designers and developers are completely different as well. If we don't clearly distinguish between the two, the logic of the design system will start to get tangled. Shall we take a closer look at what exactly those differences are? First, let's talk about state. State refers to internal changes or interaction conditions within a component. For example, when a button is pressed, it's active. When it's deactivated, it's disabled. And when it's processing, it's loading. The same goes for inputs, like when they are focused or filled. In short, it's a concept that focuses on how is the user interacting with this component? Or what is the component itself doing right now? On the other hand, status is a bit of a different story. It's not about the movement inside a component. Instead, it's an indicator of external data notifications or showing what stage a process is currently in. Good examples of status are the success, error, or warning messages you see in badges or toasts. It also includes whether a progress bar is in progress or complete. Simply put, you can think of it as the answer to what result or information is the system trying to tell the user. So, why exactly do we need to be this meticulous about distinguishing these terms? When a designer defines and applies precise terms, like margin versus padding or state versus status, in the right context, it completely changes the quality of communication with developers. When we use a precise language, conversations with developers become much smoother, and unnecessary rework simply disappears. But most importantly, that detailed design intent you poured into Figma can finally be reflected perfectly within the code. I hope you take away that choosing the right terminology is that tiny difference that ultimately determines the overall quality of a design system. Don't you find yourself having these thoughts every time you design a new screen? Oh, this button is a bit different from the existing ones. Let's just add another option. Or, this is a unique case, so let's just add one more exception. But what happens if you keep adding options on the fly without any clear guidelines? The design system gets heavier and heavier, and eventually you'll find yourself sinking into a swamp of exception cases that nobody can control. At that point, you're not building a design system. You might actually be destroying it. The key thing we must remember is this. A proper design system isn't just an all-in-one toolbox with tons of options. Real skill lies in how deeply you've thought about scalability, the ability to withstand future changes. So let's dive into why mindless option adding is dangerous and what true scalable design really looks like. Here are 4 buttons lined up on the screen. At first glance, they probably all look like very similar main buttons to you. But what if these buttons are all existing together within a single design system? Let's take a look at the details one by one. First, let's take a look at their names. Button under bar primary, button blue, button under bar primary, and button under bar main. Some were written using snake case, while others were written using Pascal case. You can already see that the naming conventions aren't consistent at all. Now let's take a closer look and dive into the specific attributes of these buttons, shall we? Now other differences are starting to stand out. The saturation of the background colors is slightly different, and some fonts are bolder than others. Even the corner radius values for the corners are inconsistent. In reality, it is very likely that these buttons were added one by one as exception cases. However, just increasing options without clear guidelines will eventually lead to breaking the consistency of the design system. Let's try comparing this situation to cooking. If you make sauces based only on your intuition without a precise recipe, you'll end up with several sauces that taste slightly different every time you make them. Eventually, your kitchen will be filled with sauces that are similar but subtly different. And this can be seen as a clear waste of resources and a failure in management. The design system is the same. If you keep adding exception cases one by one without clear guidelines, even the designers themselves will fall into confusion, wondering, what should I use in this case? The moment a developer next to you asks, exactly which button should I apply to this screen? You find yourself in a very awkward situation that keeps repeating. When this happens, collaboration between designers becomes difficult as well. Since everyone is working with components that have different standards, the design tone will become inconsistent across different screens. This only leads to a continuous increase in unnecessary communication costs just to get everyone back on the same page. Ultimately, the trust between designers and developers will start to shake. As the design system becomes increasingly heavy and the consistency of implementation drops, the overall quality of the product will inevitably decrease. It reaches a point where the design system we created actually ends up holding us back. In the course of our actual work, we receive a wide variety of requests from other departments or fellow designers. At this point, design system leads shouldn't just accept every request as it is. They must be able to objectively filter these requests through the design system criteria that we have established. For instance, you decide whether it can be sufficiently replaced by an existing option, whether to respond by slightly modifying an existing value, or if it is truly necessary to create a new rule. The important thing is not simply increasing the number of options, but rather expanding the design system in a healthy way within the defined principles. So just because you've designed a component beautifully doesn't mean the design system is finished. There must be clear documentation of guidelines that explain how to use the component and in what situations it should be used. Ultimately, only after completing this entire documentation process can we say that a proper design system has been built and is truly ready for release. Everyone, there is one thing I'd really like to say before we begin this design system course. This is not just a tutorial on how to use the latest features of Figma. What we will focus on is not which button to click, but rather how to logically embed user experience principles into every single component. At the same time, we will take a deep dive into what makes a design developer friendly, ensuring smooth implementation into code, and explore the essence of a sustainable design system that doesn't break down over time. Please don't settle for being just a technician who follows guides and copies features. I created this course with the hope that you will become a designer who builds a truly living design system, as a product designer who views and designs the entire product structurally. Now, let me give you a summary of how my course will be structured. What exactly is a true design system? The planning part, the design part, and the development part. These three sections do not operate in isolation. The intention of the planning is captured in the design, and that design is then accurately reflected in the code. This organic flow itself is exactly how a design system functions. Within that process, let's think about the journey of a designer creating just a single button. It's not simply about finishing a pretty rectangle. There is so much to consider. What the planning intention behind this button was, how it should react when a user clicks it, and whether there will be any confusion for the developer during implementation. A designer is someone who must deeply consider all these connecting links. That is why I believe this. The true core of a design system is ultimately the designer. While technical tools and fancy code are important, please don't forget that it is the designer who serves as the central axis, bringing the system to life and establishing its core logic. Now, shall we take a look at the overall workflow of design system tasks? The very first thing to start with is the principle. This is the stage where we answer the question, what are we building this system for? It is a process of establishing the direction of the user experience and defining the core principles that will serve as the criteria for all future design decisions. Next is the design token. It is a magical stage where you can apply changes to all assets with just a single edit. The key here is to design a flexible, meaning-based token hierarchy so that you can respond quickly to style modifications or theme changes. The next stage is the foundation. This is the time to prepare the solid ingredients that will determine the quality of the system. In this stage, You will meticulously build the grid system, layout rules, and the most basic units of style. Once these ingredients are ready, it is finally time to create the component. I like to call this creating a living organism. This is a very important stage where you are not just making pretty assets, but designing organic parts that include interactions and logic. Once you have created all the components, you now need the documentation process, a manual that anyone can read and use. By writing usage instructions, exception cases, and user experience guides, you are ensuring the continued vitality of the design system. Finally, we reach the hands-off stage. This is the moment when the drawings we created are transformed into an actual product. The entire workflow is completed by delivering guides so that developers can implement them accurately and aligning the final sync between the code and the design. From now on, we will go beyond simply learning the features of Figma. We are going to explore the true principles of a design system, building the framework of a product and enduring future changes. At first, distinguishing each term and every single value might feel a bit tricky and difficult. However, the time you spend contemplating those subtle differences will accumulate, and eventually, you will prove your design through solid code. Please don't worry alone. I will be right by your side, guiding you step by step. I sincerely support your journey as you grow beyond being a technician and evolve into a product designer who creates wonderful products. In the next video, we'll talk about the starting point of a design system. Thank you for staying through this long video. I'm Dudu.